it seems to be never ending. And that is a distraction to you. I really wonder how that affects you. What do you say to yourself about that? Because it seems to never be ending.
It's a never-ending thing.
Dr. Phil is dishonest, and his conduct in this interview is reprehensible. He's a gaslighter, he's a liar, and a conspiracy theorist. Two celebrity fraudsters sitting together role-playing. One, the aggrieved former president who lost an election but can't handle it psychologically. Maybe Dr. Phil should have talked about that. Donald Trump, the pretend mogul from The Apprentice, meeting the pretend therapist, Dr. Phil. 151 days to go. This is the warning. It is June the 7th, 2024, and Dr. Phil has entered the arena to interview Donald Trump. But more importantly, on CNN with Abby Phillip, Dr. Phil invades on the American criminal justice system and criminal court proceeding in Manhattan, opining on areas and subjects that he has no idea whatsoever about what he's talking about.
Well, first off, I'm sympathetic to what Trump has gone through in this particular trial because I think it was not a proper due process for him. I would say the same thing if it was Biden or anyone else in that process.
Dr. Phil is glib and full of shit at an epic level. And here's the thing about Dr. Phil and his Donald Trump fetish. Whatever is going on in Dr. Phil's life, a need for attention, a Nora Desmond syndrome, he's obviously clever enough to understand that if he could appeal to Trump with sympathy, that the convicted felon was railroaded, he'd get his shot. And then he gets to go on CNN and spew nonsense.
I think you don't have someone that is considered to be an accomplice in a crime that has pled out or made a non-prosecution agreement and allow that information into the jury's awareness because it's very prejudicial and is not really probative of anything that they're asked to be problem solving or consider.
Who are you referring to there?
Michael
Cohen. I mean, well,
yes.
Dr. Phil, I don't want to get too deep into the law here, but it is not uncommon at all for people who are accomplices to crimes, people who have taken plea deals, non-prosecute. That is not uncommon at all for those people to then testify in subsequent trials for their alleged co-conspirators. That's kind of how a lot of these prosecutions work.
Well, really, give me examples of where that has been considered appropriate.
I mean, look, prosecutors are prosecuting organized crime all the time, and in a lot of those cases, they are relying on co-conspirators to put people who are at the higher levels of the organization behind bars. I don't understand how you can say that because someone signed was not prosecuted, signed a non-prosecution agreement, that information or their testimony cannot be presented before the jury if they were a part of the alleged scheme.
Well, you'll have to give me an example to respond to.
Hey, Dr. Phil, let me introduce you to Sammy the Bull Gravano. He used to work for John Gotti. Guess who Sammy the Bull testified against? The problem with Dr. Phil is that he is to therapy what Pastor Paula is to faith. Let's watch her in action.
Hamanda aka ata raka teda baka sanda ata ambo osa tata rite eke banda ata rike didi ashata.
All over the country, my sister included, there are people working to help people with their mental health. Dr. Phil has exploited those people, the people who need help, and he's gotten very, very, very rich doing it. And now Dr. Phil has entered the political arena, as is his right as an American. But he's talking nonsense. His actions are deceptive. Dr. Phil is not on your side, and you can't trust Dr. Phil. And the evidence of that is the interview ahead. And let's understand something. Dr. Phil could be naive for a lot of different reasons. But the simple truth is that if he were less ignorant of history, then he would understand something. What he would know is that there is no political candidate who has ever promised to lock up and prison his political opponents, that has ever not delivered on that promise when they got power. And when you lock up political opponents, that's the end of democracy and the beginning of tyranny. And that is what Dr. Phil, blinded by the greed for attention, is conning you about. Because Donald Trump means every word about what he's saying, because he keeps saying it over and over and over again. And on a day where the United States of America commemorated and honored the sacrifices of the American forces and those of the allied nations that died in battle to free the world from slavery, Dr. Phil did his part to desecrate the memory by gaslighting America with his friend Donald Trump. Two celebrity fraudsters sitting together role-playing. One, the aggrieved former president who lost an election but can't handle it psychologically. Maybe Dr. Phil should have talked about that. And Donald Trump, the pretend mogul from The Apprentice, meeting the pretend therapist, Dr. Phil. Watching this atrociousness is difficult. I've done it, so you won't have to. But one of my favorite parts is when Dr. Phil leads Donald Trump through a grievance list of all of the things that are upsetting to Trump, and then asks him basically, are you sad? How do you get through it all?
They need to stop this. They need to stop pursuing you. Since you started your campaign in 2015 to run for office, there have been so many attempts to get you off the board even before you started your campaign.
I don't know, Dr. Phil. Defaming E. Jean Carroll, threatening the nation, giving Vladimir Putin a green light to invade NATO allies and start World War III. How does he do it? What an amazing person. The Donald.
And that judge was just as bad, just as corrupt. A corrupt judge. I have to pay $91 million to a woman. I have no idea who she is. She wrote a book and she made a statement in the book. And you know that case. That case is a disaster. And then but I have no idea who she is. And they said I did things. These people are corrupt and in some cases incompetent.
By the way, Dr. Phil, why didn't you ask Donald Trump about the rape finding against E. Jean Carroll and ask about his obsession, why he won't stop abusing her publicly? Why not? You know why, Dr. Phil? Because you're full of shit. This is where Dr. Phil really begins to show himself and demonstrate how contemptible and dishonest he is. Dr. Phil is exposing himself as a shill. Again, Dr. Phil can hang Donald Trump posters all over his bedroom walls. Dr. Phil can fill his cupboards with Art of the Deal board games and books. He can hang Trump University degrees from the foyer of his estate. None of that is what we are talking about. What we're talking about is Dr. Phil's dishonesty, Donald Trump's insanity, and sedition and assault against American democracy. What I want you to listen for is Donald Trump asserting the lie. And the lie that he is telling is poisoning our society, our literal civilization, born in 1776, that we celebrated just yesterday with commemorations about D-Day, about democracy.
You mentioned I got impeached twice and I won twice very easily, very quickly. We had great support from the Republican Party.
President Biden said something that mattered a great deal yesterday. He said that democracy is worth dying for, and it is. And it's exactly what Ronald Reagan said 40 years ago.
You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man.
They knew, beyond any doubt, there are things that are worth fighting and dying for. Freedom is worth it. Democracy is worth it. America is worth it.
Now, the big lie, the lie that is strangling our democracy, the demented lie of a loser is this. When Trump says, I won twice, it is not so. Donald Trump lost the election. He lost the election to the former vice president of the United States, the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, who is the president of the United States, because he won the election. It is not true that Donald Trump won. There is no evidence. There are no facts. There is no reality that supports his lie, which is a criminal act now because it manifested itself into an insurrection, to violence, to an extremist fascist movement. What is the question that Dr. Phil asks? Does he ask a clinical question about the delusion? Does he ask a question about the inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy? No, that's not what Dr. Phil does. Dr. Phil piles on. He jumps into the lie pool to deceive you for the purposes of helping his pal achieve his goal of, yes, locking up his political opponents. Dr. Phil is dishonest, and his conduct in this interview is reprehensible. He's a gaslighter, he's a liar, and a conspiracy theorist. Most importantly, though, when it comes to talking about criminal law, this man has no idea what he's talking about. He's doing to an analysis of the law what Kristi Noem did to her puppy. Boom. President Biden remains in France, and he will give a speech today about democracy from a place where staggering sacrifices were made. At Pointe du Hoc, assaulted at dawn by the 2nd Ranger Battalion. The Rangers were led by a man named James Rutter, Big Jim. After the war, Colonel Rutter returned home to Texas, where he became the president of Texas A&M and desegregated the school and admitted women and helped build it into what it is today, one of the greatest institutions of learning in the world. He died young at 59 years old, but was among the greatest of the greatest generation. At the top of the cliffs, there is a monument. It's a Ranger dagger, and it symbolizes the knives the Rangers thrust into the rock as they scaled the cliffs, described by Ronald Reagan 40 years ago from the exact spot during one of the highlight speeches of his presidency.
Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion, to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Allies had been told that some of the mightiest of these guns were here, and they would be trained on the beaches to stop the Allied advance. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades, and the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe.
Joe Biden will lift his voice in a moment of grave crisis, dishonesty, and demagoguery. There is a war underway in Ukraine. There is a war of aggression being fought on Europe that is terrifying the leaders of our allied nations, because it is their cities and their citizens who will be hit first, but not last. This is a dangerous moment for the world. Last night, Donald Trump convened a gathering of two fools who stewed each other, who stroked each other's grievances, who stroked each other's egos, who stroked each other's fantasies. But what President Biden's going to talk about today is very real. It's very dangerous, the world we live in right now. More than 600,000 Russians have become casualties in Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin says there is to be no Ukraine. It's to be snuffed out, subsumed by Russia. This is no different than the Hitlerism of the late 1930s and 1940. No different at all. And it must be opposed now when it can be stopped before the whole world is on fire again. before our democracy began to disintegrate under the weight of an accumulation of idiocy, greed, and all manner of vile stupidities. There was a generation that understood the magnitude of the sacrifices and the fragility of the world. It was an era where the country was led by greatness, whether it was moral leadership like Martin Luther King at the commencement of the Civil Rights Movement, or the former Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, the 34th President of the United States, General of the Army, Dwight Eisenhower. 20 years after Normandy, the former president, General Eisenhower, returned to the beaches with Walter Cronkite. And at the end of that interview, he shared something with Walter Cronkite. The impact of what he talked about is more important now, in this moment, than it has ever been. These words are from the man who was the Supreme Commander 20 years after the event, sitting in the graveyard with the men he had met the night before in those famous photographs. A former president now, 5 years left in his life. Listen to President Eisenhower.
So every time I come back to these beaches, or any day when I think about that day 20 years ago now, I say once more, we must find some way to work to peace and to really to gain an eternal peace for this world.
Listen to what this great man says, and then ponder the vileness of what Dr. Phil and Donald Trump did. What Dr. Phil did was excuse these political threats and use his platform to justify them, to justify the violence, to let Donald Trump's lies easily pass over him. No, Donald Trump did not win the election. But yes, he did try to overthrow the government. What did those men die for? And remember what Reagan said. Remember what Biden said. Remember what American presidents of good faith and goodwill said. There are things worth dying for. Listen to what General Eisenhower says. Because what Trump is, should it return to power, will cause chaos and disaster and tragedy. He means his threats. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. They're bullshitting you. He's a taker, seeks to take freedom, liberty, rights, including the rights of those who dare to stand up and disagree, including the January 6th committee. Are you kidding me? The answer to all of this must be a resounding and forever no. Never. Not in America. Not in 2024. Our children will not live in that world. I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.